The U.N.S. Pathfinder glided into the docking cradle of Stellara Gateway with the practiced silence of a veteran vessel. Inside, xenolinguist Lyra Nova smoothed the front of her regulation blue jumpsuit, a nervous flutter in her stomach that had nothing to do with the slight gravitational shift. Stellara Gateway was a marvel of interspecies cooperation, a glittering latticework of docking rings, habitat domes, and trade forums, all orbiting a serene blue gas giant. Today, however, it was the stage for a particularly delicate first contact. Trade negotiation with the Zydonian Hegemony. Captain John Lee's voice, calm and steady, came over the internal comms. Ms. Nova with me, standard diplomatic attire, and Lyra. He paused, a rare hint of something softer in his usually gruff tone. Just be yourself, your professional self. Lyra offered a weak smile to the comms panel. Understood, Captain. Being herself was usually the easy part. It was the professional constraint when faced with the genuinely alien that she sometimes struggled with. Her empathy was a powerful asset in understanding linguistic nuances, but it also meant she felt new encounters, new beings, with an intensity that could be overwhelming. The Zydonians were waiting in a reception hall that shimmered with cool, refracted light. They were tall, slender beings, their forms composed of what looked like interlocking crystalline segments that shifted through subtle hues. Their faces were arrangements of facets, unreadable to human eyes, and they communicated through modulated, light patterns emanating from their chests and delicate chimes that Lyra's universal translator struggled to imbue with emotional inflection. The initial introductions were stiff. Captain Lee, a rock of composure, exchanged formal greetings with the Zydonian delegation leader, whose designation translated roughly as Facilitator Dresh. Lyra stood slightly behind Lee, diligently recording the light patterns and resonant frequencies, trying to match them to the flat monotone translation. The incident, when it came, was minor, almost comical. As Facilitator Dresh presented a data crystal containing the Zydonian trade overtures, he made a complex gesture involving a series of rapid light pulses and a high-frequency chime. Lyra, misinterpreting it as a signal to receive the crystal, directly rather than wait for Captain Lee, took a small, eager step forward, her hand outstretched. An awkward silence descended. Facilitator Dresh froze, his light patterns stuttering. Captain Lee subtly cleared his throat. Lyra's face burned. Realization crashed down on her, a breach of protocol. Profound embarrassment, hot and sharp, flooded through her. "Oh, my deepest apologies," she stammered, the words tumbling out. "I misunderstood. Please forgive my forwardness. It was not my intent to disrespect." She felt her cheeks flush, a wave of genuine, heartfelt remorse washing over her as she retreated a step. It was then that it happened. A nearby Zydonian, data conduit, a thick crystalline tube pulsing with soft blue light, suddenly flared bright white, then dimmed erratically. Several of the smaller personal interface devices worn by the Zydonian aides flickered, their melodic operational chimes briefly desyncing into a discordant jangle before correcting themselves. The Zydonians didn't react overtly, but Lyra, hyper-aware, noticed a fractional, almost imperceptible tightening in their crystalline structures. Facilitator Dresh continued the ceremony after a pause that felt an eon long, handing the crystal to Captain Lee as if nothing had occurred. Later, as the human delegation returned to the Pathfinder, Captain Lee cast a sideways glance at Lyra. "Everything. All right, Nova, you looked like you'd seen a ghost." "Just a bit flustered, Captain," she murmured, still feeling the residual heat of her embarrassment. "Their protocols are precise." She didn't mention the strange sensation she'd felt just as the Zydonian tech had glitched, a faint, almost subaudible hum that seemed to resonate deep within her chest, a counterpoint to her own mortification. Unbeknownst to her, in the Zydonian wing of Stellara Gateway, technicians were already examining the energy logs. A senior Zydonian analyst, Veridian Zaan, noted the anomalous energy spike. "Origin?" His light patterns pulsed at a subordinate. "Unknown. Investigator Zaan," came the chiming reply. "Localized. Transient. Correlated precisely with the human. Delegation's presence in reception hall Gamma 7. No external interference detected. Zaan's multifaceted face remained impassive, but a tendril of what in a human might be called curiosity began to unspool within his logical mind. The humans were new to this sector, their biology and technology still largely uncatalogued by the hegemony. This echo in the code was unexpected. The days following the initial meeting were filled with painstaking negotiations. While Captain Lee and his team wrangled over trade clauses and resource exchanges, Lyra Nova found herself under a subtle, almost imperceptible form of Zydonian scrutiny. Minor technical glitches continued to plague the Zydonian sectors of Stellara Gateway, particularly in areas adjacent to the Pathfinder's docking ring or the quarters assigned to the human crew. Lights would flicker when Lyra passed. Data slates would momentarily freeze, and once a nutrient dispenser in the shared cultural exchange lounge released a cascade of brightly colored but ultimately inedible Zydonian gel cubes, just as Lyra laughed heartily at a joke from a crewmate. Then came the official request. Investigator Veridian Zaan, the same Zydonian who had noted the initial energy spike, wished to conduct a cultural exchange and physiological data sharing session with xenolinguist Nova. Captain Lee was immediately wary. "They're singling you out, Lyra," he said, his brow furrowed in the Pathfinder's briefing room. "This isn't standard, I don't like it." "Perhaps they're just curious about xenolinguistics from a human perspective, Captain," Lyra offered, though a knot of unease tightened in her own stomach. She felt like a particularly interesting insect about to be pinned to a board. "Perhaps," Lee conceded, his gaze sharp. "But Zydonians aren't known for idle curiosity. Their interest is always purposeful. Stay professional. Keep your comm active. I want a full recording." The exchange took place in a sterile Zydonian observation chamber, softened slightly with holographic representations of Zydonian geological formations. Veridian Zaan was polite, his light patterns calm and steady, his translated voice a soothing monotone. He asked numerous questions about human language development, neural pathways related to communication, and even human artistic expression. "Your species exhibits a wide range of expressive vocalizations and facial contortions," Zaan observed, his head tilting almost imperceptibly. "These often correlate with what your texts describe as emotional states. Can you elaborate on the functional purpose of, for example, joy?" Lyra, trying to bridge the immense cultural gap, explained, "Joy isn't always functional, investigator. It's a feeling, a response to something positive, something beautiful, or a connection with others." She paused, searching for an example. "I remember when I was a child, my grandmother took me to see the great auroral comets of Kepler 186f. The sky was alive with shifting curtains of light, reds and greens and violets, dancing across an ocean of stars." As she spoke, the memory bloomed vividly in her mind, a surge of pure, unadulterated happiness and wonder filling her. Her voice softened, her eyes unfocused for a moment, lost in the recollection. "It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. I felt like my heart was going to burst with happiness." At that precise moment, the Zydonian environmental control system in the chamber gave a distinct whump. The ambient lighting, usually a cool analytical blue, suddenly blazed a warm, intense gold, and the temperature spiked several degrees. Zaan's crystalline hand, resting near a control panel, recoiled slightly as the panel itself emitted a surprised-sounding chirp. Lyra blinked, startled back to the present. "Oh, is everything all right?" Veridian Zaan's light patterns pulsed, rapidly for a moment before stabilizing. "A minor system recalibration," his translator stated, though the word minor seemed at odds with the sudden, almost theatrical change in atmosphere. He made a series of subtle gestures, and the lighting and temperature slowly returned to normal. His multifaceted gaze, however, remained fixed on Lyra with an intensity that was hard to decipher. He didn't mention the incident again, quickly moving on to other topics. But Lyra felt the shift in his attention. It was no longer just polite inquiry. It was focused, analytical, and deeply, profoundly interested. Later, Captain Lee reviewed the recording, his frown deepening. System recalibration? That was a power surge, plain and simple, and it happened the exact moment you were talking about being happy. It's probably just a coincidence, Captain, Lyra said, though the conviction in her voice was weak. The feeling from the reception hall, that strange internal resonance, had returned, fainter this time but undeniably present during her recollection. Unseen by the humans, Veridian Zaan was meticulously reviewing his own sensor logs from the chamber. They showed a distinct bioenergetic flare emanating from Lyra, perfectly synchronized with her description of joy and the subsequent environmental system overload. He cross-referenced it with the initial incident in the reception hall, a different emotional spike, embarrassment, apology, yet a similar, albeit weaker, energy signature and technological effect. His logical Zydonian mind struggled to categorize it. It wasn't a deliberate emission of energy. It wasn't any known human biological process documented in their databases. It was something else. He wouldn't call it emotion affecting technology. That was preposterous, something from primitive myths. It was, he concluded, a unique human bioenergetic field, highly sensitive to their internal chemical states, which could, under certain circumstances, interfere with sophisticated Zydonian systems. He forwarded his preliminary findings to the Zydonian High Council. The reply from High Counselor Malachor was swift and bore a distinct pulse of concern. The human delegation on Stellara Gateway exhibits unprecedented energy fluctuations, correlated with heightened physiological states. Origin and mechanism unknown. Potential for unintentional systemic interference. Moderate to high. Monitor closely. Contain if necessary. Veridian Zaan gave the order. More sensitive, specialized Zydonian sensors were discreetly deployed throughout the sections of Stellara Gateway frequented by the human delegation, all calibrated to focus on one individual, xenolinguist Lyra Nova. The meticulously ordered rhythm of Stellara Gateway was abruptly shattered by news from the outer Zydonian protectorate. Star system after star system, Zydonian outposts and patrol vessels were falling silent. The initial reports were fragmented, choked with static and terror, whispers of the Chrono-Reavers. These were not conventional aggressors. The Chrono-Reavers were described as non-corporeal, ghost-like entities that drifted through the void, drawn to complex energy signatures. Where they passed, temporal fields warped and buckled. Technology, especially the precise clockwork systems favored by the Zydonians, decayed at an alarming rate. Starship computers would loop endlessly. Navigation systems would project futures that had already passed, and even the fundamental structure of Zydonian crystalline technology would begin to unravel. Worse, sentient beings caught in their wake experienced profound psychological distress as their perception of time became unmoored. Moments stretching into eternities, memories replaying out of sequence, the steady march of causality dissolving into a terrifying, chaotic blur. The Zydonian Hegemony, whose entire civilization was built upon principles of unwavering logic and temporal predictability, was uniquely vulnerable. On Stellara Gateway, the usually calm light patterns of the Zydonian contingent began to flicker with uncharacteristic agitation. A subtle tremor, like a discordant subharmonic, ran through their normally serene chiming communications. Panic, an emotion rigorously suppressed and almost genetically bred out of their species, began to manifest in these minute, telltale signs. Lyra Nova witnessed it firsthand. In the shared observation dome, usually a place of quiet contemplation, she saw younger Zydonian attaches, their crystalline forms usually vibrant with confident hues, now dull and flickering erratically. Their movements were jerky, their responses to queries delayed and disjointed. She overheard snippets of distressed Zydonian transmissions, the normally precise cadences fractured by something akin to fear. The sheer scale of the reported suffering, the silent ships, the minds lost in temporal eddies struck Lyra with a force that was almost physical. A wave of profound compassion, sharp and aching, washed over her. Sorrow for the Zydonians facing this incomprehensible horror, empathy for the terror they must be feeling, even if they couldn't name it as such. She stood by a viewport overlooking the star-dusted void, her hand pressed to the cold transparasteel, a silent ache in her chest for the distant, unseen victims. It was at that exact moment that something extraordinary occurred. Across Stellara Gateway, Zydonian communication systems, which had been struggling with interference and distorted signals from the affected sector, suddenly cleared. For a precious few minutes, transmissions from besieged outposts came through, with startling clarity, offering vital data. Last words, desperate warnings before the inevitable static reclaimed them. Diagnostic systems throughout the Zydonian wing of the station reported a temporary, inexplicable stabilization of local temporal flux. Veridian Zaan, deep within his monitoring station, saw it all. His specialized sensors, still keenly focused on Lyra Nova, registered an immense bioenergetic surge emanating from her, different in signature from the spikes caused by her embarrassment or joy. This was broader, deeper, a resonant wave that correlated perfectly with the station-wide communication clarity and temporal stabilization. It pulsed outwards from her location in the observation dome, a silent, invisible balm. He was, to use a human term, dumbfounded. The Chrono-Reavers' disruptive field was notoriously difficult to counteract. Zydonian science had no defense against it, only mitigation strategies that were proving increasingly ineffective. Yet this human, with no conscious effort, seemed to have soothed it, at least locally, temporarily. Captain Lee, ever vigilant, noticed Lyra's distress. "Nova, are you unwell?" Lyra turned from the viewport, her eyes glistening. "It's just terrible, Captain, what those Reavers are doing." A helpless anger mingled with her sorrow. If only there was something we could do. High Counselor Malachor, addressing the anxious Zydonian delegation via a shimmering holographic projection, dismissed the brief period of clear communication as a transient null point in the Reaver energy matrix. He urged adherence to established Zydonian protocols and the deployment of more sophisticated, and failing, technological countermeasures. The idea that a primitive, emotional human could have any bearing on such a crisis was beneath consideration, but Veridian Zaan could not dismiss it. The data was irrefutable. The human emotional state, this time intense sorrow and compassion, had produced a tangible, widespread, and constructive effect. He replayed the energy signature, compared it to the chaotic waveforms of the Chrono-Reavers. They were almost harmonic opposites. A seed of a truly radical, almost heretical thought began to germinate in his logical mind. The Chrono-Reavers were advancing. Stellara Gateway was well within their projected path, and standard Zydonian methods were failing. The news worsened with each passing cycle. A frontline Zydonian fleet, dispatched to intercept the Chrono-Reavers before they could reach the sector containing Stellara Gateway, had been decimated. The few garbled transmissions that escaped the engagement zone painted a grim picture, ships aging to dust in minutes, targeting computers locked in precognitive loops, entire crews succumbing to temporal psychosis. The Reavers didn't fight in a conventional sense. They simply were, and their presence unmade the orderly reality the Zydonians depended upon. A handful of Zydonian escape pods, battered and scarred, were eventually retrieved and brought to Stellara. The survivors were husks. Their crystalline structures were dull, their internal light fractured and chaotic. They chimed incoherently, their minds shattered by the temporal vortex they had endured. Medics reported that their perception of time was so distorted that a single second could stretch into an agonizing subjective year, or hours could pass in a blink. There was no Zydonian medical or psychological treatment for such a condition. High Counselor Malachor, his holographic image radiating an increasingly strained aura of command, addressed the concerned factions on Stellara. He spoke of reinforcing temporal shields, of rerouting power to experimental chronoton dampeners, solutions that had already proven ineffective against the sheer scale of the Reaver advance. His pronouncements, usually met with disciplined Zydonian accord, were now received with a muted, flickering disquiet. The logic was sound, the engineering principles impeccable, but the enemy did not play by logical rules. Veridian Zaan watched the unfolding catastrophe, a cold knot of something that felt perilously close to despair tightening within him. He had dedicated his existence to the pursuit of knowledge through logic, to the elegant equations that described the universe. But those equations offered no solace now, no solution. He saw the broken survivors, heard the strained pronouncements of his High Counselor, and the foundation of his Zydonian worldview began to crack. His mind kept returning to Lyra Nova, to the energy signatures, embarrassment causing localized interference, joy overloading a system, and then, most significantly, compassion and sorrow seemingly counteracting the Reavers' temporal distortion field, bringing clarity from chaos, however briefly. He reviewed the data again and again, cross-referencing, analyzing. The patterns were undeniable, however improbable. It was not a simple bioelectric field. The complexity, the resonance, the intent he was almost forced to ascribe to it, it aligned more with Lyra's own descriptions of her emotional states. The thought was terrifying. It was an affront to millennia of Zydonian philosophy, which held emotion as a primitive, chaotic flaw, a remnant of unprocessed sensory input. Yet the logic of the situation was equally stark. Zydonian methods were failing, Stellara Gateway, and everyone on it was in mortal danger. With a resolve that felt like stepping off a cliff, Veridian Zaan bypassed standard channels. He requested an urgent private meeting with Captain Jian Li and xenolinguist Lyra Nova in Tust. The Pathfinder's small conference room, the air was thick with tension. Captain Li's face was a mask of grim professionalism, Lyra's etched with concern. Zaan, for the first time in Lyra's experience, showed signs of Zydonian strain. The hues within his crystalline form shifted more rapidly than usual, a subtle indicator of internal dissonance. Captain Li, Ms. Nova, Veridian Zaan began, his translated voice flat but carrying an unusual weight. My people are facing an existential threat. Our conventional defenses against the Chrono-Reavers are insufficient. We're aware, investigator, Captain Li said, his voice tight. The Pathfinder is on standby. We'll evacuate if the order is given. But we won't abandon Stellara unless there's no other choice. Zaan's multifaceted gaze fixed on Lyra. Ms. Nova, my observations suggest that your unique biological energy signatures, those that correlate with your pronounced emotional states, have demonstrated an ability to interact with, and in one instance counteract the temporal distortions caused by the Chrono-Reavers. Lyra stared at him speechless. Captain Li frowned. Emotional states? Investigator, with all due respect, are you suggesting Lyra's feelings can fight these things? The skepticism was palpable. I am suggesting, Veridian Zaan clarified, his light patterns pulsing with focused intensity, that the energy you emitted during your empathic response to my people's suffering resulted in a measurable, significant, and positive stabilization of local temporal fields. The data is unequivocal. He projected a complex holographic display showing Lyra's energy signature overlaid with the Reaver distortion waves and the subsequent period of clarity. It is a radical hypothesis, counter to all Zydonian understanding, but given our current trajectory, it is a hypothesis I believe we must explore. The silence in the room was profound. Lyra felt a shiver trace its way down her spine, not of fear, but of a terrifying, dawning understanding. The strange resonances, the glitches, they weren't just coincidences. What exactly are you proposing, investigator? Captain Li asked, his voice dangerously soft. I propose, Veridian Zaan stated, the hues within him momentarily steadying into a deep, determined sapphire, that Ms. Nova may be our only hope. Just then, alarms blared throughout Stellara Gateway. A cold, synthesized Zydonian voice cut through the air. Warning, Chrono-Reaver entities detected. Vector, Stellara Gateway, estimated arrival, imminent. High Counselor Malakor's holographic image appeared on the Pathfinder's main view screen, his form flickering with agitated light. All Zydonian forces to battle readiness. All non-essential personnel to designated temporal shelters. This reliance on primitive superstition, he pulsed, his gaze seemingly directed at Zaan's unseen location, is an insult to Zydonian logic. We will meet this threat with technology and reason. But his voice was drowned out by the rising wail of the proximity, alerts. The logic of despair was giving way to the terror of imminent destruction. The approach of the Chrono-Reavers was not a visual spectacle of incoming ships, but a creeping sickness in the fabric of space-time. Lights on Stellara Gateway began to flicker and dim erratically. Consoles displayed gibberish, their internal, chronometers skipping and stuttering like dying heartbeats. A low, disorienting hum pervaded the station, making teeth ache and thoughts scatter. High Counselor Malakor's voice, already strained, crackled over the comms, ordering Zydonian defense, platforms to fire experimental chronoton lances. Streaks of energy dissolved harmlessly into the distorted space around the Reavers, achieving nothing. In the Pathfinder's conference room, the immediate shock of the alarms gave way to grim urgency. Captain Lee looked from Lyra, pale but resolute, to Veridian Zaan, whose crystalline form pulsed with a desperate light. "Your hypothesis, investigator," Lee said, his voice cutting through the rising chaos. "If there's a chance, any chance at all, the risk to Ms. Nova is unknown," Zaan stated, his gaze fixed on Lyra. "The energy required, the focus, it could be significant." "I understand," Lyra said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the tremor in her hands. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but beneath it, something else was stirring, a fierce protective instinct. She thought of the Zydonian survivors, their minds shattered. She thought of the crew of the Pathfinder, her friends, her family in the void. "If there's something I can do, I have to try." Thorne nodded curtly. "All right. Zaan, what do you need from us?" "The Pathfinder's primary sensor array is more robust than our standard station emitters," Zaan explained rapidly, his light patterns flickering in complex sequences as he interfaced with a PADD. "If we can modify it to focus and amplify Ms. Nova's bioenergetic field, guided by her emotional projection, it might create a resonant frequency strong enough to disrupt the Reaver's temporal dissonance on a larger scale." It was a wild, desperate gamble. Modifying a starship sensor array to amplify human emotion sounded like something out of a fever dream. But the Pathfinder's chief engineer, a pragmatic woman named Rena Patel, listened intently to Zaan's technical specifications, her brow furrowed in concentration. "It's unorthodox," she finally said. "The field dynamics are unlike anything we've ever worked with, but the principles of focused energy projection, some of it makes a twisted kind of sense. We can try to rig a focusing conduit." While Patel and her team raced against time, tearing apart sensor conduits and rerouting power relays, Lyra sat in the Pathfinder's auxiliary bridge, now a makeshift amplification chamber. Wires snaked from a jury-rigged console to adhesive pads placed on her temples and wrists. Veridian Zaan monitored a complex holographic display showing her biosignatures and the incoming Reaver waves. Captain Lee stood beside her, a silent, reassuring presence. "High Counselor Malakor has forbidden this," Zaan chimed softly, his light patterns flickering with what Lyra was beginning to recognize as Zydonian anxiety. "He considers it a dangerous perversion of science. Malakor can debate the ethics later," Lee growled. "If we're still here. Lyra, are you ready?" Lyra closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. The disorienting hum of the Reavers was stronger now, pressing in on her mind, trying to fray her focus. She had to find an anchor, an emotion strong enough to push back against the encroaching chaos. Fear was easy to find, but it was cold and brittle. She needed something else. She thought of the raw courage of the Zydonian pilots who had flown into the temporal maw, knowing the risks. She pictured the grim determination on Captain Lee's face, the unwavering loyalty of the Pathfinder's crew. She reached deeper, to the core of her being, to the fierce, almost painful love she felt for life itself, for the spark of consciousness in any form. human or alien. A love that rebelled against the senseless unmaking the Reavers represented. Symphony of courage, she thought, a harmony of resolve. She focused on that feeling, nurturing it, letting it swell within her. It wasn't a conscious intellectual effort, but an opening of floodgates. The terror was still there, a discordant note, but the rising melody of courage, determination, and protective love began to overpower it. Her energy readings are astounding, Zaan breathed, his multifaceted eyes fixed on his display. The amplitude is increasing, forming a coherent wave pattern. On the auxiliary bridge, the makeshift amplifier began to hum, its lights glowing brighter. A warmth spread through Lyra, a sense of immense power flowing through her, yet not from her, more like she was a conduit for something vast and profound. The disorienting pressure in her head lessened slightly. "Hold on, Lyra," Captain Lee murmured, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. Outside, the first tendrils of the Chrono-Reavers' temporal distortion field began to brush against Stellara Gateway. The station's own defensive systems sputtered and died. The hum intensified, and the very structure of the Pathfinder seemed to groan. Then from Lyra, from the humming amplifier, it came. Not a sound, not a light, but a wave. A wave of pure, focused, emotional energy. The approaching Chrono-Reavers, insubstantial and terrifying, suddenly wavered. Their chaotic energy signatures, usually a maelstrom of temporal noise, showed minute deviations, their inexorable advance faltering as if they had encountered an invisible reef. The wave pulsed outwards from the U.N.S. Pathfinder, an invisible tsunami of harmonized intent. Lyra Nova was at its epicenter, a fragile human conduit for an astonishing torrent of emotional energy. The symphony of courage she had invoked, a potent blend of fierce determination, protective love, and an unyielding resolve to shield those around her, resonated through the modified sensor array, amplified and focused into what could only be described as a temporal shockwave. It wasn't a destructive force in the conventional sense. It didn't blast or burn. Instead, it was a wave of profound, ordering resonance. As it washed over the approaching Chrono-Reavers, their chaotic, time-distorting energies encountered a diametrically opposing force. The Reavers, beings intrinsically tied to temporal dissonance, reacted violently to this imposition of stability. Their ghostly forms, which had seemed to absorb and nullify all conventional Zydonian weaponry, now flickered and spasmed. The disorienting hum they generated faltered, replaced by a series of screeching, tearing sounds that seemed to echo across dimensions rather than through normal space. The very fabric of their being, woven from disrupted time, began to unravel as Lyra's emotional energy imposed a coherent, stable, temporal field. On the Pathfinder's auxiliary bridge, Veridian Zaan watched his instruments with an expression that on a human would be wide-eyed awe. "The Reaver energy signatures are destabilizing," he chimed, his voice losing its monotone quality for the first time, replaced by sheer astonishment. "Their temporal distortion fields are collapsing. It's working." Lyra felt the strain. It was like holding back an ocean. Every fiber of her being was taut, focused, channeling the emotional storm. Sweat beaded on her forehead, and a deep exhaustion was beginning to seep into her bones. But the image of the Zydonian survivors, their minds lost, and the unwavering presence of Captain Lee beside her, fueled her resolve. She pushed more, dug deeper, offering every ounce of her courage, her hope. The effect on Stellara Gateway was immediate and profound. Light steadied and brightened. Systems that had been failing flickered back online, their internal chronometers synchronizing with startling speed. The oppressive, mind-bending pressure that had gripped the station lifted as if a physical weight had been removed. More astonishingly, many of the Zydonians on the station felt it. Their crystalline structures, naturally sensitive to resonant frequencies, vibrated in sympathy with the emotional wave. It was an utterly alien experience for them, a direct, unmediated influx of what they could only dimly perceive as raw feeling. For some, it was bewildering, For others, it was a strange, unexpected warmth, an echo of courage, of unity, of something profoundly alive that their logic-driven culture had long since dismissed or suppressed. High Counselor Malachor, in the Zydonian Command Center, watched his tactical displays with stunned disbelief. The Reaver signatures were vanishing, not in explosions but fading, dissipating like smoke in a strong wind. His own defense systems, moments before inert, were now reporting full functionality within a rapidly expanding zone of temporal stability, centered on the human vessel. He saw the energy readings impossibly high originating from the Pathfinder. The primitive superstition he had so vehemently condemned was achieving what the combined might of Zydonian technology could not. He was, for the first time in his long life, utterly speechless, his internal light patterns flickering in abject confusion. The last of the Chrono-Reavers dissolved, their temporal distortions smoothed away by Lyra's relentless emotional broadcast. Silence, clean and sharp, descended upon the space around Stellara Gateway. The only sound on the Pathfinder's auxiliary bridge was Lyra's ragged breathing and the soft hum of the now cooling amplification array. She slumped forward, caught by Captain Lee before she could fall. "Status?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Reavers." "Gone," Lee managed, his own voice thick with disbelief and an overwhelming sense of pride. He looked at Veridian Zaan, whose multifaceted eyes seemed to glow with an inner light. "The temporal field is stable," Zaan confirmed, his chimes soft, almost reverent. "Completely stable, enhanced even. Ms. Nova, you have saved Stellara Gateway. You have saved us all." Lyra offered a weak smile, exhaustion finally claiming her. As she drifted into unconsciousness, the last thing she felt was Captain Lee's steadying grip and the awestruck, utterly transformed gaze of Veridian Zaan. The Zydonian investigator's worldview had not just been shattered, it had been irrevocably and spectacularly rebuilt. The power of human emotion was no longer a hypothesis. It was a manifest truth, a force capable of reshaping reality. The silence that followed the Chrono-Reavers' dissolution was more profound than the mere absence of their chaotic hum. It was a silence filled with stunned disbelief, dawning realization, and the first, tentative stirrings of a galactic paradigm shift. Stellara Gateway was secure, its systems not just restored but, in some inexplicable way, refined by the lingering resonance of Lyra's emotional shockwave. Lyra Nova awoke in the Pathfinder's medical bay some hours later, feeling like she'd run a marathon through a hurricane. Captain Janley was there, a rare look of open admiration on his face. Veridian Zaan stood nearby, his crystalline form pulsing with a soft, warm, amber light Lyra had never seen him exhibit before. "Welcome back, Ms. Nova," Zaan chimed, his translated voice gentler than she'd ever heard it. "Or perhaps we should address you as Temporal Harmonizer Nova." A hint of what might have been Zydonian humor touched his tone. Lyra managed a weak smile. "Just Lyra is fine. What happened?" "You happened, Lyra," Captain Lee said, his voice filled with quiet pride. "You faced down a threat that had the entire Zydonian hegemony on the ropes, and you did it with you. The Zydonian hegemony was, predictably, in an uproar. High Counselor Malachor, his authority and rigid adherence to dogma thoroughly discredited, had been quietly recalled from Stellara Gateway. The initial reports from Zaan, coupled with the undeniable reality of the Reavers' defeat and the lingering, pervasive sense of emotional resonance felt by many Zydonians on the station, had sent shockwaves through their logical, ordered society. Veridian Zaan had become the de facto new liaison to humanity, his earlier heretical theories now validated in the most spectacular way possible. He formally, publicly acknowledged humanity's, and specifically Lyra's, crucial role in saving Stellara Gateway and countless Zydonian lives. He spoke not of bioenergetic fields, but with a newfound cautious respect of profound human emotional resonance and its capacity for extraordinary interdimensional influence. For Lyra, the experience was transformative. She was no longer just a linguist. She was an accidental envoy of a power her species hadn't known it possessed. The weight of it was immense, but also strangely liberating. Her intense emotions, once a source of occasional awkwardness, were now recognized as a potential strength, a unique human gift. In the days that followed, as the U.N.S. Pathfinder prepared for its departure, a new dynamic settled between the humans and the Zydonians. The hegemony initiated a cautious, galaxy-wide internal debate, a process that would likely take generations, about the nature of emotion, the costs of its suppression, and its potential role in their understanding of the universe. Some Zydonians, particularly those who had directly experienced the emotional wave on Stellara, began to exhibit subtle changes. Their light patterns became more varied, their chimes more melodic, their interactions less rigidly formal. Captain Jian, Li found himself looking at his crew, at humanity, with new eyes. They were flawed, chaotic, often maddeningly illogical, but they possessed a depth, a resilience, a capacity for courage and compassion that could, it seemed, literally change the stars. As the Pathfinder finally undocked from Stellara Gateway, Veridian Zaan transmitted a final message. The Zydonian Hegemony thanks you, U.N.S. Pathfinder, and especially xenolinguist Lyra Nova. You have taught us that there are forces in the universe that logic alone cannot comprehend. Perhaps emotion is not a flaw, but another, equally valid language of existence. Lyra stood on the Pathfinder's bridge, gazing at the receding jewel of Stellara Gateway against the vastness of space. She felt a profound sense of peace, mingled with anticipation. The galaxy was suddenly a much wider, more mysterious, and more hopeful place. Humanity's journey among the stars had just taken an unexpected, extraordinary turn. On Stellara, Veridian Zaan watched the human ship diminish into a pinpoint of light. A new, subtle warmth suffused his crystalline structure, a quiet echo of the courage he had witnessed. It was the dawn of a new era for Zydonian understanding, and for their relationship with the strange, emotionally potent beings called humans. The universe, he now knew, held more wonders than his logic had ever dreamed.